Blessings to all, and welcome to the second episode of the World Around the World series. It is an honor and a privilege to be able to share this word of encouragement with you all today. Greetings to the Holy Spirit, who is the head of my life. Greetings to our General Overseer, Bishop Donald Maxwell, to our International Youth Director, Reverend Durbin Taylor, to our Regional Youth Director here in New York, Light Brigade Larice Taylor, and to my pastor here in Rosedale City Mission, Reverend Dr. Stephen Strawn, and to all the ministers in their respective places, I greet you all in the matchless name of Jesus. The text I will be reading today is taken from Isaiah 41, verses 8 through 21. And if I were to assign a theme to this, it would be Don't Fear, I Have Chosen You. And if you have your word, you can read along. And it reads, But thou, Israel, art my servant, Jacob, whom I have chosen, the seed of Abraham, my friend. Thou, whom I have taken from the ends of the earth, and called thee from the chief men thereof, and said unto thee, Thou art my servant, I have chosen thee, and not cast thee away. Fear thou not, for I am with thee. Be not dismayed, for I am thy God. I will strengthen thee, yea, I will help thee, yea, I will uphold thee with the right hand of my righteousness. Behold, all they that were incensed against thee shall be ashamed and confounded. They shall be as nothing, and they that strive with thee shall perish. Thou shalt seek them and shalt not find them. Even them that are contended with thee, they that war against thee shall be as nothing, and as thing of naught. For I, the Lord thy God, will hold thy right hand, saying unto thee, Fear not, I will help thee. Fear not thy worm Jacob, and ye men of Israel. I will help thee, saith the Lord, and thy Redeemer, the Holy One of Israel. Behold, I will make thee a new sharp threshing instrument, having teeth. Thou shalt thresh the mountains and beat them small, and shalt make the hills as chaff. Thou shalt fan them, and the wind shall carry them away, and the whirlwind shall scatter them. And thou shalt rejoice in the Lord, and shalt glory in the Holy One of Israel. When the poor and needy seek water, and there is none, and their tongue faileth for thirst, I, the Lord, will hear them. I, the God of Israel, will not forsake them. I will open rivers in high places and fountains in the midst of the valleys. I will make the wilderness a pool of water, and the dry land springs of water. I will plant in the wilderness the cedar, the shittah tree, and the myrtle, and the oil tree. I will set in the desert the fir tree and the pine and the box tree together, that they may see and know and consider and understand together that the hand of the Lord has done this, and the Holy One of Israel has created. And the word of the Lord is already blessed. Now, before we dig any further into the text, I'm going to provide a bit of background information on the physical, the mental, and the spiritual state of Israel. So the text we're reading is taken from the time where the Israelites were free from their exile from Babylon. And to further explain how we got to this point, we can backtrack all the way to where Israel was free from the Egyptians. Now, most of us are familiar with the text, but for those who are not, I will do a brief synopsis. So God calls Moses his manservant to free the Israelites, and he tasks him with the responsibilities to lead them out of the land of Egypt. And later on in the text, we see where Joshua is now handed this mantle. Also in the text, we see where Moses receives the 2 stone tablets, that which contains the 10 commandments. And Moses receives this and shares these laws to the Israelites. Now, the Israelites are not just traveling out of Egypt into the wilderness with no destination. God promised them land, the promised land specifically. And the promise that God had made to the Israelites were not unconditional. The conditions that God had promised the Israelites included that they have to follow and be obedient to the laws that he gave Moses in order to retain the land. So for a while, the land was theirs. But then after that, the Israelites started to sin against God, and they started to worship false idols and started to participate in idolatry, which goes against the very first commandment. So like God said, he stripped the land away from the Israelites, and he allowed them to be taken captive by the Babylonians. Now we see where Israel is in captivity, and we have to understand that when God speaks, it shall come to pass. And we're familiar with this saying, but usually we associate this with the blessings that God has in store for us. We understand that when God says we're going to get this or something that we desire, we know it shall come to pass. But when God speaks and says that he's going to remove something that he sees we're not yet ready for, it also shall come to pass. So when God speaks, he means it will come to pass both punishments and blessings alike. So now Israel is in captivity, and they're in a strange and foreign land that they are not familiar with. And we see that after time, after 70 years, Israel begins to develop feelings of neglect and abandonment. And they believe that God has truly forsaken them, that he has turned their back against them, and that they have reached the end of the line. And the Israelites feel as though God's grace has run out. And when we're in our low state, sometimes we may feel as though God has just neglected us and abandoned us. And sometimes we feel that we're so far away from God that there's no way that his grace will be able to reach us where we're at. But today I want to remind someone that God's grace is sufficient and he can reach us no matter where we are. There's nowhere we can go that God cannot reach us. God's grace can never and it will never run out. So now let's look at verse 10 of the text. It says, "Fear thou not, for I am with thee. Be not dismayed, for I am thy God. I will strengthen thee, yea, I will help thee. I will uphold thee with the right hand of my righteousness." God says, "I will strengthen thee," because his strength is made perfect in our weakness. He says, "I will help thee," because God knows that along the way, we will stumble and we will fall. So he's there to help us and guide us along the way. And then he says, "I will uphold thee." God knows that along the journey, we're going to become faint. We're going to become weak. So he's going to give us a shoulder to lean on, and says he's going to uphold us with his right hand of righteousness. God's intention is never to neglect them, and he will never neglect us in our lowest state. Even in Israel's darkest moments, God has never neglected them, because he's not the kind of God who's going to abandon you just because you're not where you're at yet. He's not the kind of God who's going to turn his back on you just because you're low. God says that even in your low state, he's going to elevate you and he's going to progress you. It's in that state where he's going to prove to you who he is and what he's capable of doing. It's in that state where we're going to see the capacity and the capability of God, because that's the kind of God that we serve. And when we recognize this, we're going to recognize the kind of God that we are serving. God's intent was never to keep Israel in captivity forever, just like his intent is never to keep us low. So God decides to show up, and he allows the Persians or Judah to overcome the Babylonians or the Assyrians. So now we witness Israel being free, and we witness them out of captivity for over 70 years. So even though their physical state has changed, even though they are free, we witness that their mental state towards God is still the same. They still experience feelings of abandonment. They still experience feelings of neglect, and they still believe that God has turned cold towards them. And sometimes we're at that place. We've all been at that place where we feel like, God, like, why am I going through this hardship? Why does it feel like you're so distant from us? Like, God, we know that you're omnipresent. We know that you're everywhere, but you feel so far away. And then we ask God, why would you allow us to be put into that situation in the first place? Israel could not comprehend why God had even allowed them to go through that situation. And yes, we witnessed Israel sinning against God and committing idolatry against God. God saying he's going to strip away the land from them, but they were not expecting to be put into captivity. So now Israel is questioning God, saying, God, why have you allowed us to be taken into captive? So why this hardship now? Why do we feel like God has all of a sudden given up on us? But God uses these situations so that he can get us where he wants us to be. The Israelites were not where they needed to be. Spiritually, they were not where they needed to be. Yes, they had the rich land and they had the wealth, but they were not at the place where God can use them. And yes, they were still regarded as God's chosen people, but they did not have the desire to seek and chase after God. In order for God to use us, in order for him to do greater in us, we have to be where he needs us. And sometimes that means God has to put us through the fire. Sometimes it means that he has to put us in the storm. Sometimes it means he has to drop us in that valley in order to refine us. But know this, those trials that he puts us through are never meant to hurt us. The Israelites could not yet understand why their exile was happening in the first place. They could not understand that their exile was not meant to break their spirits, and it was not meant to discourage them or break them down, but it's meant to bring them out even stronger and even greater than they were prior. God brings us through the fire, and we come out as pure gold. And even in the fire, God is with us. Recall the story of the 3 Hebrew boys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They refused to bow before the statue that the king had made, King Nebuchadnezzar. And for this, they were thrown into a fiery furnace. Now, when the king looked into the furnace, he asked his guards, "Was it not 3 men that I threw into the furnace? But lo, and behold, I see a 4th man resembling the Son of God." Even in the fire, God is with us. And the story even goes on to say that when it was time to remove the 3 Hebrew boys from the fire, the guards who was responsible for taking them out affected the wrath of the fire. They were affected by the flames of the fire. They were burned. They became singed. But the 3 Hebrew boys who were taken out of the fire did not have a single hair on their head burned. They came out of the fire unscathed. So even in the fire, God will preserve us, because he's a faithful God. He's an unfailing God, and he will never forsake us. So now we see Israel at the place where God is able to use them. They're at the place where God needs them to be. And so God gives them a reminder, because after enduring those hardships, after enduring those trials, we can forget who God is and what he's capable of doing. So God reminds his chosen people who he is, what he can do, and what he will do for those who will serve him. He says, "Israel, I have taken you from the ends of the earth. I have called you." So let's talk more about the calling of God. The call of God, it's unique to every individual. The call of God, it carries purpose. And when God has chosen you and when he calls us forward, he plants in us a purpose. And that purpose is typically far greater than we are. And when we think of the people in the Bible who God has called forward, for example, Samuel, we see that the purpose goes beyond Samuel himself, because Samuel later on is given the task to anoint the future king, King David. So when we are obedient to the call of God, our purpose becomes fulfilled. When we are obedient to the call of God, he's able to do greater in our lives. And our purpose is not because of us, but we are called according to his grace. 2 Timothy 1 verse 9 says, "Who has saved us and called us with an holy calling, not according to our works, because there's nothing that we can do, but according to his own purpose and grace, which was given us in Christ Jesus before the world began." So let me tell you what this means. It means that we don't need the list of credentials. We don't need the big status. We don't need a big reputation in order to be considered by God. The word says that we were predestined. He had a plan for us before we were even born. So don't become fearful because you don't have it all together yet, because we are chosen. And don't start to doubt and don't start to hesitate because you don't know where the road might lead to, because we are chosen. God has a plan for us. It says, even before we were formed in our mother's womb, God had already had a plan for us. He already knew how it would end. And his plan is to prosper us and to give us an expected end. And the verse that stood out to me in this text was verse 15. And it goes as far as to say this: "Behold, I will make thee a new sharp threshing instrument having teeth. Thou shalt thresh mountains and beat them small, and shall make the hills as chaff." And the first word that came to mind when reading this verse was upgrade. Because let me tell you what God is doing right here. That's God elevating us. Fresh out of the fire, straight out of the storm, right out of the valley, God is saying elevation. I'm going to make you a new instrument. I'm going to turn you into a new creature. That mountain that you could not tear down before has no chance now, because I'm going to make you new. And those situations and hardships that you felt like you could not overcome is no longer going to be in your way, because I'm going to completely transform you. Keep in mind that God does not say he's going to restore us, and he doesn't say that he's going to mend us here. God says, I'm going to make you new. I'm going to completely transform you so that I'm going to be able to do greater in your life. He says, I will make you new. And he couldn't work in you the way he could before, but right now he's saying, I'm going to upgrade you. And he couldn't do this and that in you before because you weren't where he needed to be. But right now, God is saying, I'm going to elevate you and I'm going to plant your feet on higher ground. And the thing is, God, he could have used us before the greater. He could have used us then. But the thing is that if he had used us in the state where we were not where he needed to be at that time, then it would only yield good results. And if he had used us before the complete transformation, then the outcome would only be mediocre. And we don't serve a mediocre God. God is saying, didn't I tell you that I wanted to elevate you? Didn't I tell you that I wanted to make you greater? Didn't I tell you that I wanted to advance you, to progress you? He is reminding us that we are chosen. He is saying, I have chosen you. You are chosen by me. So don't you dare let fear seep in and convince you that it's too late for you. And don't you dare start getting in your own head and allowing judgment to cloud your mind. He's saying, I have called you, and what I have for you is for you and you only. It doesn't matter how far, how distant you feel from me. I'm telling you that what I have in store for you can only be for you. The purpose I have designed for you is for you. Because the calling that God has on our life cannot be revoked. It cannot be removed. He has designed that call and that purpose for you and you only. And before I close, I want to look at verse 18. It says, I will open rivers and high places and fountains in the midst of the valleys. I will make the wilderness a pool of water and dry land springs of water. And if we look at the verse before that, it speaks to when we are calling on God, when we are thirsty and there is no water anywhere. God is saying, this is what I will do for those who call upon me. This is what I will do for those who serve me. I will turn a seemingly impossible situation and I will make it possible if only you will follow the purpose that I have planted in you. If only you will hear and seek my calling. This is what I will do to those who serve me. And after he delivers us, after he brings us out of that situation, he wants us to understand that we are not delivered because of a coincidence. It is not by sheer luck that we have overcame that situation, but it is because that he has brought us out, like verse 20 of the text suggests. And when we realize that it is God who has brought us out, when we face another situation, we will not begin to hesitate and we will not begin to fear and we won't worry or doubt because we've seen God deliver us out of our lowest. We've seen him pull us out when we were at our lowest, when we thought we could not make it through. So even in our darkest moments, God will never forsake us. Sometimes God will put us through trials, but it's because he needs us to be at that place where he can fully use us and where he can make the purpose that he has planted in us even greater. 1 Peter 2 verse 9 says, but ye are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a peculiar people, that you should show forth the praises of him who have called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. God is calling us out of the darkness. He is reminding us that we are his chosen people, that we have been set apart. And once we realize what God has called us to do and who he has called us to be, fear will never occupy our hearts. Even hesitate when it comes to God, because what he has in store for us is far greater than we can imagine. So when doubt arises, remind yourself that you are chosen, and not only are you chosen, but you are chosen by God. I pray this word has encouraged you all, and I pray that you have taken something away from it. I pray that you understand that God has planted purpose in us, and he calls us and he wants to use that purpose and elevate us to greater. And once we're obedient to the call of God, once we walk into the path that God has set for us, he will be able to use us and fully transform us and use us for his purpose and make us a new vessel. Thank you for the opportunity to share these words of encouragement with you all today. Thank you and God bless.